There is an animal alive on Earth today whose whole world died out around it. Picture what that world looked like. Just 50,000 years ago, which is nothing at all in the story of our planet, this animal walked through forests that were home to tiny elephants, no bigger than cows. Above it, huge meat-eating storks, almost 6 feet tall, fought over dead bodies for food. Birds like vultures, but much smaller than the ones we know, flew in circles overhead looking for scraps. There were people there too, a very short kind of human, only about 3 feet tall, known today as the Hobbit, hunting the very same small elephants that this animal was hunting. Giant rats as big as small dogs ran through the same forests, and lizards even bigger than the one we are talking about crawled the same ground. That whole world is gone now. The small elephants died out 50,000 years ago. The giant storks died with them. The vultures disappeared. The hobbit people vanished around the same time. The giant rats mostly died off. The bigger lizards living nearby went extinct by the time the last ice age ended. Everything that world was built around simply stopped existing. And yet, on 5 small islands in Indonesia, sitting at what used to be the far edge of a piece of land now swallowed by the sea, one animal from that lost world is still alive. Fewer than 1,500 grown breeding members of this animal remain anywhere on Earth. By almost any normal rule of biology, this creature should have died out long ago. The animals it once hunted are gone. The other big predators that once shared its home are all dead. The strips of land that once connected its islands to the mainland are now underwater. The weather has changed completely. The whole natural system it once lived inside has fallen apart. And somehow, through some mix of luck, location, and biology that scientists are still trying to fully explain, this animal keeps walking around on the islands of Komodo, Rinca, and Flores, hunting deer and buffalo almost as if the last 50,000 years never happened. One scientist who has spent years trying to understand this creature has called it the last lizard standing, the only survivor of a world that, in every other way, no longer exists. This is the story of the Komodo dragon. Not the version most people already know, the giant lizard, the dangerous bite, the 10-foot body, the thing tourists take pictures of. This is the real story. Where this creature truly came from, what kind of world it was shaped for, why that world disappeared, and the strange, almost accidental reasons it is somehow still with us. What follows is, in many ways, harder to fully understand than most stories in the study of animals and their survival, and every part of it really happened. Let's begin with a question that up until about 15 years ago, no scientist could properly answer. Where did the Komodo dragon actually come from? For most of the last century, the common explanation went something like this. The Komodo dragon belongs to a group of lizards called monitor lizards, the same family that includes several other kinds of large lizards found across Africa, Asia, and Australia. Most of these lizards are not very large, so the Komodo dragon was seen as a strange exception, a normal-sized lizard that had been stuck alone on small islands for a very long time and had slowly grown much bigger because there was nothing else around big enough to compete with it. The usual story said that without other large predators around, and maybe because it specialized in hunting the small elephants living on Flores, this lizard had simply grown, generation after generation, into the giant creature we know today. It was a tidy explanation, and it made sense on the surface. It was also almost certainly wrong. In 2009, a team of scientists led by a researcher named Scott Hocknull, working at a museum in Australia, published a study that changed the whole picture. The name of that study, once you understand what it means, is almost unsettling. It was called Dragon's Paradise Lost. For 3 years before that, the team had been digging up fossils across eastern Australia. When they compared these old bones, some as much as 4 million years old, to the bones of Komodo dragons alive today, they matched. The Komodo dragon, the animal everyone assumed had grown up in Indonesia, actually came from Australia. It had been living on the Australian mainland for at least 3.5 million years before it ever set foot in Indonesia. And here is the key part. It had not grown large because it was stuck on a small island. Its huge size already existed on the mainland long before it ever reached those islands, alongside other giant relatives of the same family. The old story. The idea that isolation on small islands made it grow big simply fell apart. The Komodo dragon did not become giant in Indonesia. It arrived in Indonesia already giant. And here the story becomes even stranger. Because back in ancient Australia, the very place where this animal first developed, it was not even the biggest creature of its kind. There was another relative living on the same land at the same time, a lizard known by scientists as Varanus priscus, more commonly called Megalania. It was the largest land lizard that has ever lived on this planet. Depending on which estimate you trust, it stretched somewhere between 16 and 18 feet long, and it may have weighed anywhere from 400 to 1,000 pounds. It was the top predator across an entire continent, hunting the largest animals of its time. And the Komodo dragon, the creature we now think of as the biggest lizard alive, was simply its smaller cousin, living quietly alongside it. This matters because the Komodo dragon, in its original home, was never seen as huge. Compared to the other creatures around it, it was just an average-sized hunter. It developed as part of a much bigger group of enormous lizards that once spread across what we now call Australia, New Guinea, Timor, and the islands of Indonesia. The reason we think of the Komodo dragon as enormous today is really a kind of illusion caused by extinction. It looks giant to us only because everything else its size, or bigger, has already disappeared. So we have an animal that started out in Australia, was once part of a much larger family of giant lizards spread across half the world, and somehow ended up stuck on 5 tiny islands far from everything else. How did that happen? The answer comes down to geography, over a length of time most people rarely think about. Roughly 900,000 years ago, during one of the colder stretches of the Ice Ages, sea levels around the entire world dropped sharply. So much water had frozen into ice sheets that shallow ocean floors between Australia and Southeast Asia were partly uncovered. Large stretches of what used to be sea became dry ground. A chain of land bridges and shallow waters formed, linking Australia to the string of islands we now know as the Lesser Sunda Islands, places like Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, Sumba, and Timor. The Komodo dragon, moving slowly westward over many generations, walked across these bridges. It reached Timor first, then Flores, and eventually Komodo, Rinca, and the smaller islands nearby. Then, slowly, over thousands of years, the climate warmed again. The ice melted, the seas rose, the land bridges sank back underwater, and the dragons that had crossed over found themselves cut off, separated forever from the larger group they had come from, now stranded on a scattered chain of small islands in the middle of the Indonesian Sea. On its own, being cut off on an island isn't necessarily a disaster. Many animals end up isolated this way, and when the Komodo dragon found itself stranded, it landed in a place still full of food. The Lesser Sunda Islands at that time were remarkable places to live. There were small elephants, descended from full-sized mainland elephants that had made their way onto the islands and, generation after generation, shrunk in size to fit the more limited resources of island life. There were giant rats, there were huge birds, there were giant tortoises. And eventually, around 700,000 years ago, the small human species known as the hobbit arrived on Flores as well. For the dragons, this was a strange new home, but it was one they could survive in. There was prey to hunt, space to live in, and most importantly, a full and working natural system around them. Then, about 50,000 years ago, that entire system began to collapse. This is the part of the story that is genuinely hard to sit with because of how complete the loss was. Over the course of just a few thousand years, nearly every large animal on Flores died out. The small elephant species vanished completely. New research from a university in Australia, published just recently, points to a long, harsh drought, lasting from roughly 76,000 to 55,000 years ago as the likely cause. This drought dried up fresh water across the island and broke down the entire food chain that the plant-eating animals depended on. The giant meat-eating storks disappeared. The small vultures vanished. The hobbit people, who had lived on the island for at least 700,000 years, disappeared from the fossil record entirely. The giant rats survived, but in far fewer numbers. And back on the Australian mainland, Megalania, the dragon's giant cousin, also went extinct. Possibly because early humans arrived there, possibly because of a changing climate, or perhaps both together. By the time the dust settled, out of the entire once thriving family of giant lizards that had spread across half the world, exactly one kind was left standing. And it wasn't the biggest one. It was the smaller cousin, stuck on 5 tiny islands in eastern Indonesia, the Komodo dragon. Try to picture that moment. 50,000 years ago, this animal lived in a world filled with small elephants, giant storks, small vultures, tiny humans, and enormous rats. Today, on those very same islands, the animals it actually hunts are deer, brought over by humans much later, water buffalo, also brought by humans, and wild pigs, also introduced. Almost nothing this lizard eats today naturally belonged on these islands to begin with. The entire web of life around it has been swapped out. The world it was actually shaped for no longer exists, and its survival today depends on animals that weren't even there when its ancestors first arrived on these shores. Which brings us to the question that a study published in 2019, running over 30 pages long, tried hard to answer. It was called Last Lizard Standing: The Enigmatic Persistence of the Komodo Dragon. Looking at everything known about this creature and how it lives, the researchers asked a genuinely odd question. Why is it still here? When the giant storks died alongside the elephants, why didn't the dragons die too? When every large native animal it once hunted vanished, when the climate shifted entirely, when the human species sharing its islands disappeared, when its giant cousins across Australia and Timor all went extinct, what let this one species in these 5 small places keep going? The study offers a number of answers, and none of them are especially comfortable to sit with. The Komodo dragon is an incredibly efficient creature. Because it's cold-blooded, it needs only about 1/10 of the food that a warm-blooded animal of similar size would need. It can go weeks, sometimes even more than a month, on a single large meal. It can switch what it eats depending on what's available, feeding on anything from small rodents and snakes up to large deer and water buffalo. It can scavenge dead animals just as easily as it can hunt live ones. It can lie perfectly still and wait, or actively chase down prey. It can swim between islands. As a young lizard, it can even climb trees. And in one of the strangest facts ever discovered about this species, female Komodo dragons are able to produce offspring without any male involvement at all, through a process called parthenogenesis. This was first recorded in 2006 at a zoo in England, when a female named Flora laid a batch of eggs that hatched successfully, despite never having been near a male. The young that result from this process are always male, and they can then go on to mate with their own mother. In other words, this species carries a kind of built-in backup plan for reproduction that almost no other backboned animal on Earth has. This is an animal that seems almost designed for emergencies, built to survive in ecosystems that are falling apart around it, shaped for exactly the kind of slow, grinding collapse that turned a once thriving island community into a scattered handful of leftover pockets. But here's the harder part of the story. That toughness may now be reaching its limits. In 2021, after years of careful study, the group responsible for tracking the conservation status of the world's species officially moved the Komodo dragon from a category called vulnerable to the more serious category of endangered. Their assessment found the species now exists in 8 separate groups, none of which holds more than 500 individuals, with a total breeding adult population estimated at under 1,400 animals worldwide. Climate projections suggest the available living space for these dragons could shrink by more than 30% over the next 45 years, mostly because of rising sea levels. These are island animals, and they live mainly along the coastal lowlands. The same rising waters that thousands of years ago in reverse carried their ancestors across drowning land bridges are now slowly closing in on the last few places they have left. This is the genuinely sobering shape of the Komodo dragon's story. It is a survivor from the Ice Age, the last remaining member of a once great family of giant lizards. It has held on across 5 small islands through a mix of using very little energy, being flexible about what it eats, being able to reproduce without a mate, and the simple accidents of geography, that the particular islands it ended up on happened to be remote enough, dry enough, and difficult enough to reach, that it slipped past every extinction event that wiped out its relatives. So when you look at a picture of a Komodo dragon, when you see that heavy, muscular reptile with its forked tongue and thick, armoured skin lying still on a sun-warmed rock along the coast of Komodo Island, what you're really looking at is something quite specific. You are looking at the only remaining member of a family line that once spread across half the planet. You are looking at a creature that, by almost any reasonable understanding of how mass extinctions work, should have died out 50,000 years ago, along with everything that once lived beside it. You are looking at an animal whose original world is completely gone, and whose current world, built around deer that humans brought over, sitting inside a national park at the mercy of a developing country's decisions, on islands whose coastline is steadily being worn away by a changing climate, is in its own way also slipping away. The Komodo dragon should not exist. If you take apart the science carefully, almost every reasonable model of mass extinction says this species should have disappeared tens of thousands of years ago. And yet, through a mix of accident, isolation, an efficient body, the ability to reproduce alone, and plain luck, here it still is. The last lizard standing. The remaining creature from an ecosystem that no longer exists, walking through what's left of its own ancestral home. And the lesson tucked inside this whole story, I think, is one we don't always want to face. The animals that make it through mass extinction events aren't always the strongest or the most powerful or the most impressive to look at. Sometimes they're simply the most adaptable, the most fortunate, and the most willing to keep going on whatever is left over after everything else has fallen apart. The Komodo dragon is alive today, not because it was built to rule over everything around it. It's alive today because it was built to hang on. And it has hung on in a place small enough and far away enough that the great disasters of the last 50,000 years couldn't quite finish the job. What happens to it over the next 50,000 years, or even the next 50, is now, in a very real way, up to us.